Hi everyone, glad to see you back on the channel. Today we need to talk about what may genuinely be the worst news Vladimir Putin has received since the war began, and why many analysts now believe this moment could mark the real beginning of the end for his entire strategy, his political survival, and possibly even his regime. For a long time, Putin has survived by controlling the narrative, managing expectations, and convincing both Russians and the outside world that no matter how bad things looked, Russia could endure, adapt, and outlast its enemies. That illusion is now breaking down, not in one dramatic explosion, but through a slow, relentless collapse of pillars that once kept his system standing. The most damaging part of this news is not just military losses, although those continue to pile up. It is the convergence of failures happening at the same time. Economic strain, battlefield setbacks, diplomatic isolation, internal dissent, and the erosion of fear are all colliding in ways that Putin's system is structurally incapable of handling. On the battlefield, the situation has moved beyond simple gains and losses. What is now happening is the destruction of Russia's ability to sustain long-term offensive operations. Equipment losses are no longer being replaced at a meaningful rate. Armored vehicles pulled from deep storage are often decades old, poorly maintained, and dangerously vulnerable. Crews are undertrained, exhausted, and increasingly aware that survival depends more on luck than leadership. Russian soldiers are not just facing Ukrainian forces. They are facing logistical breakdowns that leave them without adequate ammunition, medical support, or reliable communications. Reports of units being abandoned, misled, or ordered into impossible assaults have become routine. This is not the behavior of an army preparing for victory. It is the behavior of an army being consumed by attrition. Ukraine, by contrast, has shifted from survival mode to strategic adaptation. The focus is no longer just on defending territory, but on systematically dismantling Russia's ability to fight. Strikes on command centers, supply hubs, airfields, and logistics corridors have forced Russian planners into constant crisis management. Every fix creates another vulnerability somewhere else. This is devastating for a system like Putin's, which depends on centralized control and rigid hierarchies. When decisions must flow upward and approval must flow downward, speed becomes a liability. Ukraine's decentralized, adaptive approach consistently outpaces Russia's bureaucratic military culture. But the battlefield alone does not explain why this moment is so dangerous for Putin. The deeper threat lies inside Russia itself. The economic consequences of the war are no longer abstract. Inflation, labor shortages, declining regional budgets, and collapsing infrastructure are hitting ordinary Russians in ways propaganda cannot fully conceal. For years, Putin maintained public support by offering stability in exchange for political obedience. That bargain is now failing. Stability is gone, but repression alone cannot replace it indefinitely. The war has consumed resources that once funded social programs, pensions, and regional development. Local officials are increasingly unable to explain why roads crumble, hospitals lack staff, and schools close while billions are spent on a war that delivers no clear success. Sanctions have played a major role here, not because they caused immediate collapse, but because they gradually suffocated Russia's future. Advanced technology imports have dried up. Industrial output increasingly relies on outdated substitutes. Energy revenues, once the backbone of the state budget, face long-term decline as Europe diversifies away from Russian supplies and global markets grow more cautious. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Less revenue means less ability to buy loyalty. Less loyalty means more reliance on force. More force increases resentment and fear. Over time, fear becomes brittle. When people stop believing the system can protect them, they stop believing in it altogether. Perhaps most alarming for Putin is the shift within Russia's elite circles. Publicly, loyalty remains intact. Privately, fractures are deepening. Business leaders, regional governors, and security officials are increasingly focused on self-preservation rather than collective success. When elites begin planning for a post-Putin future, even quietly, the system enters a terminal phase. Putin has always managed elite competition by positioning himself as the ultimate arbiter, the only figure capable of preventing chaos. But as chaos grows anyway, his value proposition weakens. When loyalty becomes a liability rather than an asset, even the most cautious insiders begin to hedge their bets. The information environment has also changed in ways that favor long-term instability. While state media still dominates television, younger Russians rely on alternative sources of information. Soldiers returning from the front bring first-hand accounts that contradict official narratives. Families who lose sons and brothers hear explanations that no longer ring true. Censorship can suppress discussion, but it cannot erase lived experience. Every funeral, every injury, every unexplained loss chips away at the credibility of the state. Over time, the gap between propaganda and reality becomes impossible to bridge. Internationally, Putin's position has never been weaker. The war was meant to reassert Russia as a great power capable of reshaping global order. Instead, it has exposed Russia's limitations. Allies have grown cautious. Neutral states have distanced themselves. Even partners who continue to trade with Russia do so opportunistically, extracting favorable terms while avoiding deeper commitments. This loss of prestige matters deeply to Putin's worldview. His legitimacy rests on restoring Russia's status after the collapse of the Soviet Union. A Russia seen as isolated, sanctioned, and militarily stalled undermines the very foundation of his political identity. At the same time, Ukraine's resilience has transformed global perceptions. What was once seen as a vulnerable state is now viewed as a capable, determined actor shaping its own destiny. This contrast further isolates Putin, turning his invasion into a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. Another critical element of this bad news is the erosion of fear as a governing tool. Fear works best when punishment is selective and predictable. As repression intensifies, it becomes more arbitrary. Arbitrary repression does not create obedience. It creates quiet defiance and widespread distrust. When people believe they can be punished regardless of loyalty, loyalty loses its meaning. This is when systems begin to crack from within, often without dramatic protests or revolutions, but through passive resistance, corruption, and non-cooperation. Putin's response to these pressures has been to double down. More mobilization, harsher laws, stricter censorship, and increasingly extreme rhetoric. Historically, this approach rarely saves regimes in decline. It accelerates the very processes leaders are trying to stop. The worst news for Putin is not that any single factor has failed. It is that all of them are failing at once, reinforcing each other. Military weakness fuels economic decline. Economic decline fuels social frustration. Social frustration fuels elite anxiety. Elite anxiety fuels political instability. This convergence is what makes the current moment so dangerous. Systems can survive isolated crises. They rarely survive synchronized ones. There is also the psychological dimension. Putin has built his rule around the image of control. He projects calm, certainty, and inevitability, but recent events suggest a leader reacting rather than shaping outcomes. Sudden policy shifts, contradictory messaging, and visible frustration all signal stress at the top. Authoritarian systems are especially vulnerable to perceived weakness. Once the image of invincibility fades, challengers become more daring, both inside and outside the system. Even small acts of defiance can inspire larger ones. The war has also permanently altered Russian society in ways that cannot be reversed easily. A generation of men has been traumatized, injured, or killed. Families have been fractured. Trust in institutions has eroded. These are long-term wounds that outlast any single leader, but they will define Putin's legacy more than any speech or victory parade. From Ukraine's perspective, the strategy is increasingly clear. The goal is not just territorial recovery, but forcing Russia into a position where continuing the war becomes more costly than ending it. That moment may be closer than many expected, not because Russia has no resources left, but because its system cannot convert resources into effective power anymore. This is why analysts describe this as the beginning of the end, not the end itself. Collapse rarely comes suddenly. It unfolds through loss of momentum, credibility, and coherence. What we are witnessing now is that process becoming visible. Putin still commands immense power. He still controls security forces, media, and institutions. But power that relies solely on coercion is expensive and unstable. Every day the war drags on, that cost rises. The final irony is that the war meant to secure Putin's place in history may instead define his downfall. Instead of restoring empire, it has exposed fragility. Instead of uniting society, it has drained it. Instead of projecting strength, it has revealed limits. Whether Putin remains in office months or years from now is almost beside the point. The system he built is weaker, more brittle, and less capable of adapting than ever before. That is the true bad news he faces, and it is news he cannot censor, arrest, or bomb away. History shows that when leaders reach this stage, their options narrow rapidly. Compromise looks like defeat. Escalation increases risk. Inaction accelerates decline. Every path forward carries consequences he can no longer fully control. This moment will likely be studied for decades as a case of strategic overreach colliding with structural weakness. It reminds us that power without adaptability is fragile, and control without legitimacy is temporary. As events continue to unfold, one thing is increasingly clear. The war has crossed a threshold. It is no longer just about territory or tactics. It is about the survival of a political system that may no longer be capable of surviving the reality it created. That is why this is not just bad news for Putin. It may be the worst news he has ever received. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel.